All right, so what we're looking at are key events for the presidents from John Quincy Adams through James Buchanan. So this is our Growing Nation Continued, Lesson 9. Where we left off in Lesson 8 was the John Marshall Court. Obviously, we talked about some of those cases that set precedent that Marshall ruled in. Marbury v. Madison with the precedent of judicial review. McCulloch v. Maryland, precedent that said that states could not tax the federal government. Power to tax was the power to destroy the federal government. And we talked about Gibbons v. Ogden that set the precedent that the federal government determined interstate trade and commerce, not states or private entities. A few other cases I wanted to hit on that dealt with Marshall and precedent. Remember, Marshall sat on the court for the remainder of his life, sat on the court for 34 years. It's a pretty remarkable run in this era, or in any era for that matter, especially in the early 1800s. So we have Fletcher v. Peck. This is a case that involved Georgia, the state of Georgia fraudulently granting 35 million acres of land along the Yazoo River to privateers. The legislature tried to repeal the land grants and contracts because there was a great deal of public outcry, but Marshall ruled that a contract was a contract, and those contracts were protected and backed by the Constitution. Therefore, states could not impair contracts. So that was a precedent in Fletcher v. Peck. Dartmouth v. Woodward, when we look back at our colleges that were established in colonial America, Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, Columbia, most of all those colleges in one way, shape, or form had to deal with a couple of different groups. Had to deal with the Crown providing a land grant or charter, and typically had to deal with, in one way, shape, or form, a colonial legislature. So in this particular situation, Dartmouth had been granted a charter by King George III. But the state of New Hampshire wanted to challenge and change the charter. Dartmouth appealed. They are going to use arguably their most famous alum to defend their case, Daniel Webster, who was part of the triumvirate we're going to learn about moving forward. He's the northern part of the triumvirate, one of the founders of the Whig Party. And in this particular case, Marshall rules in favor of Dartmouth, saying an original contract must stand, much like the Fletcher v. Peck case. A contract was under constitutional protection. In Cohens v. Virginia, the Cohens, not of Big Lebowski and Fargo fame, but Philip and Mendez Cohen, were tried for falsely selling lottery tickets, and they were tried by the state Supreme Court in Virginia, and they lost. They appealed the case, and Marshall decided to hear the case and overturn the decision. This sets a precedent that the federal court, the Supreme Court, is the highest court in the land, and the federal court has the ability to appeal state decisions. And then this is a sort of like the polar opposite, Worcester v. Georgia. When the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830 by Congress and signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, a number of tribes, and we'll talk more about them as we move forward, are going to be pushed off their ancestral lands and reservations east of the Mississippi and pushed west of the Mississippi in what is present-day Oklahoma and Kansas. In this particular scenario, rather than taking up the hatchet and fighting The Cherokee decided, ironically enough, the people that Jackson had fought with in the War of 1812 and in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend against the Lower Creek, Jackson had actually adopted a Cherokee child. They are going to go to the courts. Yeah, and they're going to go to the courts, and they are going to win this case. The Cherokee are going to be ruled a sovereign nation and one that should keep their ancestral land. But Jackson ignored John Marshall's order, saying, Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. This is a very interesting scenario because never before had the executive branch ignored a ruling by the Supreme Court. And what does Jackson have at his disposal to ignore this order? Military and the support of Congress. All right? So this was a very tumultuous situation, and it's going to lead to what becomes known as the Trail of Tears, one of the worst events and absolutely shameful events in American history that we'll talk a bit about later. Do you guys have any questions about those Marshall Court cases? All right, so moving right along, everybody in here probably understands what a tariff is. It is a tax on a foreign good. Tariffs are passed. We've had tariffs throughout American history. We still have tariffs today. Tariffs are passed to protect American business. The first major tariff that was passed in 1816. It was not extremely high, but it was sort of an aggressive tariff of 20 to 25%. Northern businesses absolutely loved it, but the South couldn't stand it because the South was not an industrial economy. The South was an agricultural economy. If you have an agricultural economy, what do you want to be able to do with your product? Sell it? Yeah? Sell it fast. Very good. Nice job. Well done. You want to sell that fast. You don't want your crops and your perishable items sitting around rotting on the docks. So the division over tariffs is going to be a theme that we're going to run with moving through the rest of the semester, because we're going to be talking about how that tariff question is a leading cause of the American Civil War. The idea is to take this tariff and use some of the revenue and to also establish another type of tax, whether it be excise or whether it be some sort of property tax. We're not anywhere close, well, we are close, but not really, to an income tax. That's going to come about during the American Civil War. Yeah, go for it. So we still got a little ways before we talk income tax. The idea here is this. Take revenue from tariffs, take revenue from taxes, and institute what is known as the American system. Build roads, build bridges, build canals. Now, many of you may already know this, locomotives have been invented by now. But we don't see that, we're not seeing locomotives being used on a large scale, and that's non-existent in America at this point. We're not far away from it. But this is the era of the canal. We're really close to steam power at this point in time. This is when the Industrial Revolution is making its way to the United States. So Henry Clay is the guy that's not only brokering the tariff, he's also the guy that's behind this idea of internal improvements known as the American system. All right? Henry Clay is tremendously important. Hanover County native. He studied law under George Wythe. He makes his way out to Kentucky to take advantage of an opportunity that he might not have in the East, and that is to get involved and fly up the ladder in politics, right? Thriving law practice, less competition on the political landscape, and not only does he take advantage of it, but he capitalizes on it. Clay is going to be a member of Congress, arguably one of the most well-recognized and legendary speakers of the House. He'll also serve in the Senate. Clay is going to be with us almost to the end of the semester, up till his death right before, just 10, 11 years before the Civil War. All right? But here's the thing about Clay. Clay has political rivals. All right? The Federalist Party, as you all already know, is gone. They pretty much fell apart after the Hartford Convention. So now, what we have is everybody is what? What political party? Federalists are gone. Yeah, they're Democratic Republicans. We're actually not too far away from them just dropping the Republican off that and just being flat out Democrats. Clay and Daniel Webster they're going to start a new party movement that we're going to be talking about moving forward, and that party movement becomes known as the Whig Party. All right? And they have some of the remnants of the Federalists. All right? To us, the idea of internal improvements, using tax revenue to pay for internal improvements, is second nature. How many of you guys in the last 10 days have traveled on an interstate? Everybody, right? Maybe some of you haven't. Most of you have. 95, 288, 64, maybe 81. All right? When we think of our interstate system, we think of using tax revenue to build and improve upon that system, we don't get too worried about it, right? Because it's kind of like second nature. But what you need to understand is the American interstate system is relatively new, right? Post-World War II. So if you're looking 200 years back at a proposal to use tax revenue to build an interconnecting road system, an interconnecting canal system, a lot of states wouldn't be on board because many of them would feel like, hey, this is an infringement upon what amendment? What amendment would they point back to? That's not the job of the federal government. That's the job of the state. 10th. Very good. Awesome. So there's an outcry that, number one, people don't want to pay taxes for it, and number two, people don't believe that it's the federal government's job. It is the state's job to build infrastructure. Any questions about that? So we're going to see some transportation developments moving forward. Here we have Henry Clay on the left, and there on the right I've got a handy-dandy graphic organizer for you. It just kind of breaks the American system down. For high protective tariff, to fund transportation, to protect American industry, notably in the north and in parts of the northwest. Transportation improvements would include roads and canals. And we're going to talk about the fact that Virginia is going to have really the only major southern canal system. What is that canal system called? The James River Canal System, or aka the Kanawha Canal, all right? The Kanawha Canal System. So we'll be talking about how many people have been down in the city and seen the James River Kanawha Canal Plaza, right? And again, how many people have done the canal walk? All right. So we're going to talk more about canals as we move into the Industrial Revolution. Industrial growth in the South and the West, cheap transportation of raw materials, manufactured goods being moved from region to region. One achievement of the American system was the National Road. And the National Road grows into a larger canal system and an even larger railroad system. So if we look at the National Road, I'm sure that many of you in this room have traveled along Route Interstate 70 or Route 40. So if you've ever driven in and around Baltimore or Frederick, or you've got family up in western Pennsylvania, or you got family out in Ohio, or you've made your way out to Indiana, Indianapolis, or all the way out to St. Louis, you've probably driven this road at some point. This also becomes connected and interconnected with the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal System, and it ultimately becomes connected with the Baltimore and Ohio and the Chesapeake and Ohio railroad systems. And that's going to come after the 1830s. Any questions about the American system? Let's talk a little bit about the corrupt bargain. The election of 1824 pitted four very starkly different candidates. Three saw themselves as candidates representing regions. One saw themselves as a national candidate. The northern candidate from Massachusetts was John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, had really one of the most decorated, if not the most decorated, foreign diplomacy, policy, and diplomatic record of anyone in American politics in this era. I don't know if you remember me talking about this earlier on in the semester, but he was sent to Europe to study and basically to be groomed as a diplomat when he was your age. He was a young man in his, actually he was younger than you. He was younger than you, being sent over to be groomed for this, really a political future, right? So John Quincy Adams represents Massachusetts. We have William Crawford from Georgia. We have Andrew Jackson, born on the North Carolina-South Carolina border, self-made man, rose to military prominence, barroom brawler, fired pistols first, asked questions later type of guy. We talked about his pistol duels. We know that he was at least involved in 13. He may have been involved in as many as 90. Okay? So he's sort of seen as a Western candidate. Clay, though representing the West, Virginian by birth, he sees himself more as a national candidate. All right? You could argue that Jackson also saw himself as a national candidate because his victory in the Battle of New Orleans had propelled him to national prominence, not to mention other events like, the battle in the Lower Creek, the battle in the Seminole, the First Seminole War. Yeah, Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So, something to think about here. The 12th Amendment is now in play. Now, we talked about the election of 1796 and the election of 1800. If you come in first place, you win, and if you come in second place, you're vice president. But that doesn't always work out too well if the person you're running against are not from the same party and you don't see eye to eye. So the greatest example of that would be what two men who were once friends and became political rivals because of their time in the executive office together. Excellent. Jefferson and who? Adams. Excellent work. Jefferson and Adams. Adams is president, Jefferson is vice president. You guys are on fire today. I'm impressed. All right? So with the 12th Amendment, now you have people running on tickets, right? So like Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine, Donald Trump and Mike Pence running on a ticket. So this is the first time. This is a very bizarre circumstance because all four candidates are Democratic Republicans. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina is running with two candidates. All right? And there's a caveat, and I want everybody to pay attention to this, okay? And that caveat is this. If a candidate does not receive over 50% of the vote, then it would be determined, the victor would be determined in the House of Representatives. So here's what happens. It becomes known as the corrupt bargain because, I want to show you here, we've got Andrew Jackson on the top left, Henry Clay on the top right, Crawford on the bottom left there, and John Quincy Adams on the right, bottom right. Let's take a look at this data. Andrew Jackson got 99%, of the electoral votes, 37.9%. John Quincy Adams, 84 electoral votes, 32.2%. Why is Crawford out of the race? He has a paralytic stroke pulling him out of the race. Henry Clay, political rival of Andrew Jackson, decides to pull himself out of the race. And this is where the corrupt bargain idea comes from, because he, as Speaker of the House, is going to put his support behind John Quincy Adams. And then when John Quincy Adams is elected by the House of Representatives, oh, guess what? Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State. Secretary of State had been the stepping stone to the presidency. All right? And if we look at it, we looked at historically, especially early on, more secretaries of state become president than vice presidents become president. And we can get into that later, that breakdown of Secretary of State versus vice presidents. And most vice presidents who become president because of what reason? Or death in office. Assassination or death in office. Here's the magic part of the data here. Neither gains what? In either category. 50%. So it goes to the House. Another interesting thing here is this. All four candidates are Democratic Republicans. This is going to be the beginning of what we would consider the third party movements. The Whigs, the Know Nothing Party, the Anti-Freemason, the Liberty Party, the Free Soilers, the Union Party, or the Constitutional Union Party. There's all these new party movements that are going to arise between this time and the start of the American Civil War, and then the most famous of all, the Republican Party as we know it. Okay? So we'll get into that moving forward. Any questions here about this breakdown? So that takes us into the presidency of John Quincy Adams. Much like his father, he was more than equipped and Harvard educated, a lot of political experience, a lot of foreign policy experience. Kind of a cool piece of Americana here. That picture of John Quincy Adams, he's our first American president to be photographed. And there's the picture. He is going to push forth a plan known as the National Program. The National Program basically is the American system. It's an internal improvement program, build roads, build bridges, build canals, create an American public university, which now is in Washington, D.C. Are you all familiar with American University? But what entity is going to cause problems for him? And this is a situation that many presidents will face. There's a group that prevents him from getting a whole lot done. Congress. Very good. Who said that? Nice job. So he's really going to be the obstacle of his only term in office is the whole looming cloud of the corrupt bargain. So he really can't get past that. He does break ground on the C&O Canal, Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. He does push forth a plan for a national observatory. He's really one of the behind-the-scenes people involved with the funding that will lead to the Smithsonian. And how many of you guys have been in the Smithsonian? It's worth everybody make that happen. It is so worth it. So he's pushing forth these ideas for like humanitarian sort of ideas for conservation. But again, he's stymied, he's blocked. All right. In fact, he gets more done after his presidency as a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, and he also becomes one of the leading members of the abolitionist movement leading up to the American Civil War. Any questions about John Quincy Adams? All right, so the election of 1828 is going to be one of the earliest landslide victories in American history. Andrew Jackson, coming off the corrupt bargain, will easily defeat John Quincy Adams in this election, and he'll also defeat Henry Clay for a second bid in the election of 1836. Jackson serves a full 2 terms. He will use what is known as the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils of war, meaning he puts friends and supporters in positions of power. How do you think that worked out for the country? Not great. Okay, a lot of corruption, a lot of incompetence. What we call this is patronage or nepotism, right? You've probably heard those words before. Another thing that propels Jackson to victory is this is the era of common manhood suffrage, or the right to the franchise, because there is a law that has been done away with. You still have to be white, you still have to be male, you still have to be 21 or over to vote, but no longer do you have to have what? You don't have to own land any longer, okay? So is this still racist? Is this still sexist? Of course it is. We're like another 100 years from women voting. We're another 150 years from African Americans, Latino, and minorities having a true equal opportunity to vote from this period of time. But the era of common manhood suffrage, it really increases the number of voters, all right? And a lot of people didn't agree with it because they felt like we're just allowing anybody to vote at this point. Because a lot of these people that didn't own land also didn't have what? They didn't have slaves. They didn't have what else? They didn't have education. There's all types of different factors here. Good job over there, guys. Well done. All right. A little bit about Andrew Jackson. Some things that we're going to highlight. We'll talk more about in depth as we move forward. Responsible for the Indian Removal Act. This is going to break treaties with Native American tribes, and it's not just 1 or 2 tribes. It's the Cherokee, it's the Fox, the Sauk, the Kickapoo, the Seminole. All these tribes are forced from their ancestral lands. Their treaties are broken. They battle in the courts. The courts rule in favor of the Cherokee. Andrew Jackson still ignores that order, and what it leads to is the event known as the Trail of Tears, where 15,000 Cherokee and thousands of other tribal, Native American tribal people will be pushed off their lands west of the Mississippi at gunpoint to lands in Oklahoma Territory, Kansas, and thousands will die. Most of those who died were elderly men, women, and children. He used more presidential vetoes than all the previous 6 presidents before him combined. His main goal in the re-election bid and the use of the veto was to prevent the rechartering of the National Bank. Henry Clay and his contingent, and a guy by the name of Nicholas Biddle, the bank president, they said the National Bank, the Bank of the United States, is the foundation of the American economy. But Andrew Jackson, he's a states' rights guy. He wants to see that money redistributed to the states and the private entities. Those state banks become known as his pet banks. The private banks become known as the wildcat banks. And within just 3-4 years' time, most of that money has all been squandered, and America winds up in a horrible top 5, top 10 economic depression known as the Panic of 1837. However, Jackson's out of office, Martin Van Buren is in office, and Van Buren gets the blame for the Panic of 1837. They start calling him Martin Van Ruin as a result of it. So it wasn't on Jackson's watch. Another interesting event that we're going to discuss in detail is Jackson's near Civil War experience with the state of South Carolina. Jackson's vice president in the first term was John C. Calhoun. But within the first year, Calhoun had resigned, returns to the state of South Carolina, and is going to run for a Senate seat, which he'll gain. The state of South Carolina was not very happy about a tariff that was passed in 1828 that was going to increase over time. Charleston, South Carolina, moved a lot of agricultural goods in and out, among other ports along Carolina coast. They threatened to nullify or not follow through with the tariff. Andrew Jackson said, you don't follow through with the tariff, I'm going to raise an army, march down there, and I'm going to hang John C. Calhoun from the first tree I can find. Henry Clay, his other political rival, steps in and works out a negotiation to lower the tariff to prevent civil war and to quell the crisis. This is not the only crisis that Henry Clay brokers. In fact, Henry Clay's nickname will be the Great Compromiser. He's involved in the Missouri Compromise. He's involved in the nullification crisis. He's involved in the Compromise of 1850. But here's the deal. People know, John C. Calhoun knows, Andrew Jackson will in fact come down there and hang him. He would have done it. I mean, he actually in the First Seminole War, he had 2 British officers executed. It almost caused an international incident that ultimately led to America buying Florida. Right? You're exactly right. I don't know if you guys heard that. An assassin, the first assassination attempt on a president, an assassin came in with 2 pistols, tried to fire on Jackson. Both pistols wouldn't fire, and Jackson beat the guy within an inch of his life. Yeah, his guards had to pull him off of the would-be assassin. So Jackson had but 2 regrets in life: that he did not kill Henry Clay in a pistol duel, and that he did not hang John C. Calhoun from a tree. So this is a very interesting character that became president in a 2-term situation, and I'm sure you're starting to understand why this was known as the Jacksonian era. And it really creates a lot of strength for the executive branch. Here we have sort of a breakdown. We've got the landslide that was this election, 68.2% of the electoral vote, over 56% of the popular vote. This is not the largest margin by any means. We'll talk about some larger landslides moving forward, but it's one of the earliest. I'd like to wrap up today by taking a look at another piece of art by George Caleb Bingham. This one's canvassing for the vote. What do we see going on here? Feels like maybe a deal's going down. There's a dog napping over in the corner. It's like a little town. Yeah. A little slice of Americana. I love this image because it really breaks down what this era of common manhood suffrage kind of looked like. We have this guy here. He's likely our politician, right? He's got his satchel of flyers, propaganda information. He's probably giving a stump speech out here on the street. Everybody's probably dispersed. He's here at the hotel. He's trying to get another, little bit more information to maybe this planter here, possibly this business owner here. This guy's probably an artisan back here. What gives us a clue that maybe he's an artisan? Yeah, he's got an apron on. Very good. So this is a kind of a cool piece of American art that really brings together this era of common manhood suffrage, because this politician, he's got to talk to these guys, and maybe these guys own land, maybe they don't. But all 3 of these guys have the opportunity to vote. And maybe he shows up to this hotel with Bibles in his bag, and he shows up to the next place with a keg of whiskey, right? Because he's got to appeal to that voter. Kind of an interesting piece here. So, any questions about this? I always like breaking this part down with you guys. So